The vampire king was inspecting a human relief camp when a grieving girl threw herself at him, sobbing into his coat. His guards reached for their weapons. Except he raised one hand to stop them, his other arm wrapping around her trembling shoulders. And in that moment, the ruler who'd never shown mercy realized he'd do anything to hear her breathe again. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The rain started as Casimir Valdrin stepped from the armored transport, cold November drizzle that turned the Ashfeld relief camp into a maze of mud and misery, and he felt nothing about it the way he felt, nothing about most things after 287 years of existence. 8 guards in black tactical gear formed a perimeter around him as his boots sank slightly into the churned earth between rows of canvas shelters that housed 2,000 humans displaced by the latest territorial conflicts, their faces appearing briefly in doorway gaps before vanishing again like nervous animals. And Lord Corvain walked 3 paces behind him, with that perpetual expression of distaste he wore whenever they visited the human sectors. The quarterly inspections were mandatory under the Relief Accords, a political formality Casimir had instituted decades ago to maintain the illusion of vampire oversight and human protection. Though in truth, he found these visits tedious, the camps all blurring together into the same smell of wet canvas and wood smoke and unwashed bodies, the same hollow eyes watching him pass, the same careful silence that meant fear rather than respect. The floodlights mounted on steel poles cast harsh white light across the muddy corridors, turning the falling rain into silver needles. And somewhere a child was crying, the sound thin and lost in the wind that made the canvas shelters flap and snap like dying birds. Casimir moved through it all with the mechanical precision of someone performing a task he had performed 100 times before, nodding when the camp administrator rattled off statistics about food distribution and medical supplies, his mind already calculating how soon he could return to Northaven and the blessed isolation of the glass throne hall, where he did not have to pretend that any of this mattered to him anymore. Then the girl broke through the security line. She came from nowhere and everywhere at once, a blur of movement that caught even his vampire reflexes off guard, and suddenly she was crashing into him, her hands fisting in his black wool coat, her weight colliding with his chest hard enough that he actually took a step backward. His guards reacted instantly, weapons drawn, 3 of them moving to intercept, but Casimir raised one hand in a gesture that stopped them mid-motion, even as his other arm came up instinctively to wrap around her trembling shoulders, and for 5 seconds that stretched into something infinite, he simply stood there, feeling her heartbeat hammer against his chest through layers of wool and silk and the thin cotton of whatever she was wearing underneath. She was sobbing, the sound raw and animal, her face pressed into his coat, and he could feel the heat of her bleeding through the fabric. Warming skin that had not been warm in nearly 3 centuries, and something in him that had been frozen for so long he had forgotten it existed, cracked open like ice breaking over a river in spring. Her grief poured over him in waves, incoherent words tumbling out between gasping breaths. Something about her sister, something about yesterday, something about an apple, and he found himself trying to understand her when he should have been pushing her away, when protocol demanded he step back and let the guards remove her, when every law he had written and upheld said this contact was forbidden. Lord Corvain's voice cut through the moment, low and precise, pitched for vampire hearing only. "Sire, protocol demands immediate separation," he said, and Casimir could hear the disgust in it, the calculation, could practically see Corvain's mind working through the implications of this breach. Every second compounds the violation. The Edict of Separation forbids prolonged contact with unsanctioned humans. Casimir did not look at him, could not look at him, because if he looked away from the girl he might lose whatever this was, this strange sharp feeling that was either pain or its opposite, and instead he heard himself say something he had never said before in 287 years of rule. Then let it compound. The words came out quiet, but absolute, and the girl made a sound against his chest that might have been a laugh or another sob, and Casimir realized with a jolt that ran down his spine like electricity that he did not know her name, needed to know her name with an urgency that made no sense. "What's your name?" he asked, and she did not respond, lost in whatever private hell she was inhabiting. So he asked again, softer this time, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. "I need your name." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, and he saw her face clearly for the first time, tear-streaked and pale and marked by a grief so fresh it was still bleeding, her eyes dark and wild with it. And when she spoke, her voice was broken glass. "Elena," she choked out. "They killed my sister yesterday. Lily was 8. Something in Casimir's chest, in that place where the ice had cracked, tightened into a fist. He had heard thousands of human tragedy stories over the centuries, had listened to pleas for mercy and cries for justice until they all became background noise, meaningless as rain. But this was different. This girl Elena, whose sister Lily had been 8 years old, was looking at him like he was still capable of being something other than the monster who ruled over the system that had killed her, and he found he could not bear the weight of that look. She started talking again, faster now, words spilling over each other. They said she reached for an apple from the market cart. That's all, an apple. And then she broke down completely, the words dissolving into sobs that shook her entire frame. Casimir looked past her to where Corvain stood 10 feet away, face impassive, one hand holding a small recording device that was undoubtedly capturing every second of this encounter for later use as evidence of his compromised judgment. And beyond Corvain to the humans watching from their shelter doorways, silent and terrified, their eyes reflecting the floodlights like animals caught in a trap. He should step away now, should let the guards remove her, should return to the transport and forget this ever happened, should maintain the careful distance he had cultivated for 287 years, because that distance was what kept him functional, kept him ruling, kept him from feeling anything at all. Instead, he tightened his arm around her shoulders and felt her heartbeat against his chest, and made a decision that would unravel everything. "Find the enforcers responsible for the death of Lily Marsh," he said to his guards, his voice carrying the weight of absolute command. "I want them identified and brought to Northaven for questioning." Corvain stepped forward, and Casimir could see the objection forming before the counselor even opened his mouth. "Sire, human deaths during lawful enforcement actions are not subject to investigation under the Territorial Code," Corvain said, each word carefully measured, legally precise, designed to remind Casimir of every precedent and protocol he was about to violate. The enforcers were operating within their assigned parameters. Casimir met his counselor's eyes and saw the calculation there, the already forming plan to use this moment against him. And he did not care because Elena was still trembling in his arms, and her sister had been 8 years old and had died reaching for an apple, and somewhere in the terrible mathematics of his ancient existence that had started to matter more than protocol. "They are now," he said, and Corvain's expression flickered, just for a moment, surprise breaking through the careful mask. Casimir looked down at Elena, at this girl who had thrown herself at the most dangerous creature in the territory, and somehow made him feel something again. "You're coming with me," he told her, and she stared up at him with those dark, grief-wild eyes, not understanding, not trusting, but not pulling away either. The rain fell harder, turning the ground to soup beneath their feet, and the humans in their shelters watched in absolute silence as their vampire king stood in the mud holding a sobbing human girl like she was something precious, something worth protecting, something worth destroying, his entire carefully constructed world to keep safe. And Casimir realized with a clarity that was almost painful that for the first time in 287 years he did not know what he was doing or why he was doing it, knew only that her heartbeat against his chest felt like the first true thing he had felt in centuries, and he would burn the world down before he let anyone stop it. The armored transport cut through Northaven's empty streets at a speed that made the glass towers blur into vertical rivers of light, and Elena sat across from Casimir in silence, so complete it felt like another kind of death, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window that he suspected she could not actually see. He watched her the entire 40-minute journey from Ashfeld, unable to look away even though he knew his attention was obvious. Even though Corvain sat rigid in the front compartment radiating disapproval through the partition. And what struck Casimir most was how hollow she looked, as if grief had scooped out everything inside her and left only the shell, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing so shallow he had to focus to hear it over the engine. She had not spoken since they left the camp, had not asked where they were going or why, had simply followed him to the transport like someone who had run out of the capacity to care what happened next, and that terrified him in ways he could not name because he recognized it. That emptiness had lived in it himself for longer than he cared to calculate. Northaven rose around them as they entered the city proper, towers of steel and glass connected by suspended iron bridges, everything sharp angles and cold light, beautiful in the way a blade was beautiful, and the streets were empty because it was nearly midnight, and humans observed curfew, and vampires had no need to walk when they could move faster. The glass throne hall materialized ahead. His official residence, a structure of modernist architecture where transparent walls met black marble floors, and every surface reflected and refracted until you could never be entirely sure what was solid and what was illusion. And as the transport pulled into the private entrance, Casimir found himself hoping Elena would say something, anything, just to prove she was still present inside that hollow shell. She did not. He led her through corridors where vampire staff moved with silent efficiency, their eyes tracking her with curiosity and something darker, and he heard himself ordering someone to prepare the guest suite on the east wing, his voice sounding strange to his own ears, too careful, too concerned, and Elena walked beside him without seeming to notice where she was or who was watching. Corvain intercepted them before they reached the residential wing, stepping out from a side corridor with that predatory precision he had cultivated over his 2 centuries of service. And Casimir felt Elena tense beside him, finally present, finally aware enough to recognize danger. "Sire, a word," Corvain said, and it was not a request. Casimir nodded to the servant hovering nearby. "Take her to the suite," he said. "Make sure she has everything she needs." He watched Elena disappear down the corridor, her white relief camp tunic stark against the black marble, and then turned to face his chief counselor with the weary certainty that this conversation would be exactly as unpleasant as he expected. Corvain did not waste time on preamble. The Edict of Separation allows vampire-human contact only during official transactions, he said, his voice low and precise, pitched for vampire hearing only though the corridor was empty. Feeding contracts, labor agreements, legal proceedings. What occurred at Ashfeld was none of those. Bringing an unsanctioned human into the royal residence violates 3 territorial laws, specifically Articles 47, 52, and 89 of the Territorial Code. Casimir leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted, and wondered when his own laws had become chains. "I am aware of the violations," he said. Corvain's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been satisfaction at having his concerns validated. "Then you understand this cannot continue," the counselor pressed. "The girl's grief is unfortunate, but the 2 enforcers who killed her sister acted within their legal rights. The child touched vampire property without permission. Section 47 authorizes immediate corrective force." Casimir closed his eyes and saw an 8-year-old girl reaching for an apple, saw Elena's face crumpling as she described it, saw the careful edifice of law he had built over centuries, revealing itself as a machine designed to crush anything human and vulnerable and small. When he opened his eyes again, Corvain was watching him with an expression Casimir had never seen before, something calculating and cold, and he realized his chief counselor was already planning how to use this moment against him. "I am invoking the sanctuary clause," Casimir said, and watched Corvain go very still. "The sanctuary clause," Corvain repeated slowly, as if testing the words for hidden traps. "Sire, that provision has not been used in 140 years. It allows the king to grant 72-hour protection to any individual, but the council will demand justification, will require you to demonstrate that the individual poses significant value to the kingdom's interests, and a human grief case does not meet that threshold." Casimir pushed off the wall and met Corvain's eyes with the full weight of 287 years of absolute authority. "Then they will receive their justification," he said. "The law is the only thing keeping 40,000 vampires from devouring 8 million humans," Corvain said. And there was an edge to his voice now, frustration breaking through the careful control. "You cannot selectively suspend it for sentiment. The entire system depends on consistent application." "I am not suspending it," Casimir replied. "I am using it. There is a difference." He walked away before Corvain could object further. Following the path Elena had taken, and behind him he heard his chief counselor's footsteps retreating in the opposite direction, sharp and angry on the marble, and knew that within the hour the Council of Seven would be receiving a very detailed account of tonight's events. The guest suite was on the east wing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and when Casimir arrived he found Elena sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing, a tray of food untouched on the side table where some well-meaning servant had left it. She did not acknowledge his presence. He stood in the doorway watching her, this girl who had crashed into his carefully ordered existence and somehow managed to make him feel things he had not felt since he was human himself, and he had no idea what to say to her. No script for this. No precedent in 287 years of rule. Near midnight, he knocked on the door he had left open, a formality that made her look up finally, her eyes focusing on him with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the faint stirring of curiosity. She did not answer, but he entered anyway, carrying a file he had retrieved from his study, the enforcer's personnel records he had ordered compiled during the drive from Ashfeld. "Their names are Dain Volkov and Saren Cross," he told her, setting the file on the bed beside her. "Volkov has been an enforcer for 47 years, Cross for 32. Both have exemplary service records. Both acted within the parameters of their training when they killed your sister." Elena stared at the file like it was a snake. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice rough from crying, from silence, from whatever private hell she had been inhabiting for the past 3 hours. "Because I am giving you a choice," Casimir said. "I can execute them tonight. No trial, no hearing, no questions. They will simply cease to exist, and you will have your vengeance. Or you can face them in a formal hearing, where you speak your sister's name into the official record, where her death becomes part of the legal archive, where she matters beyond being another casualty statistic." Elena looked at him for the first time since the camp, really looked at him, and he saw her trying to understand something that made no sense to her. "You could have just killed them," she said. "Why give me a choice?" "Because you have had everything else taken from you," Casimir replied, and the words came out more raw than he intended. "I will not take that too." She studied his face with an intensity that made him want to look away, want to retreat behind the mask of kingship he had worn for so long. It had become indistinguishable from his actual face. But he forced himself to hold still under her scrutiny, forced himself to let her see whatever she was looking for. "Why?" she asked again, and this time the question was different, sharper, aimed at something deeper. "Why do you care?" Casimir had no answer that made sense, could not explain the crack that had opened in his chest when she crashed into him, could not articulate why her heart beat against his ribs, had felt like the first true thing he had experienced in centuries, could not justify his need to keep her breathing when he had watched thousands of humans die with perfect indifference. "Because you are still breathing," he said finally, helplessly, "and I need you to keep doing that." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the transport, charged with something electric and fragile, and Elena's expression shifted through emotions too quick to name before settling into something that looked like recognition, like she had seen something in his face that mirrored something in herself. "You are lonely," she said, and it was not a question. Casimir felt the words hit him like a physical blow, accuracy cutting through defenses he had not known he was maintaining. "Yes," he admitted, because there seemed no point in lying. Not to her. Not when she had already seen through to the ancient emptiness he carried. "I have been lonely for a very long time." Elena nodded slowly, as if this explained something, and when she spoke again her voice was steadier. "I will do the hearing," she said. "I will speak her name." Casimir felt something in his chest unclench, relief flooding through him with an intensity that was almost painful, and he realized he had been holding his breath waiting for her answer, terrified she would choose death, would ask him to execute the enforcers, and then herself, would take the easy way out and leave him alone again in the endless cold. "Thank you," he said, inadequate and true. She looked down at her hands, at the file beside her, at the untouched food. "What happens after 72 hours?" she asked. "After the sanctuary ends?" Casimir had been avoiding that question, had been focused only on keeping her alive through the immediate crisis. But now it rose between them unavoidable and urgent. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I have 72 hours to figure it out." Elena met his eyes again, and he saw the faint spark of something that might have been hope or might have been the simple animal will to survive, and either way, it was enough. She was still breathing. That was enough. He left her then, retreating to his study, where he spent the next 2 hours reviewing legal precedents and historical records, searching for some framework that would allow him to protect her beyond the sanctuary window. And at 2:35 a.m., his computer chimed with an incoming message alert that he knew before opening would be from Corvain. The message was brief, encrypted with the Council's highest security protocols, addressed to all 7 Council members, with Casimir copied as a courtesy. "The King has invoked sanctuary for a human grief case," it read. "Recommend immediate oversight and formal inquiry into His Majesty's judgment capacity. Attached medical scans suggest possible neurochemical compromise. Advise emergency session within 24 hours. Casimir stared at the screen, at the careful political maneuvering disguised as concern, at the trap Corvain was setting with surgical precision, and he understood with perfect clarity that his chief counselor was no longer simply objecting to a policy decision, but actively working to remove Elena, and possibly remove Casimir himself, if his protection of her could be framed as evidence of compromised leadership. The 72-hour clock had started ticking. The council would arrive. And Casimir had no plan except the absolute certainty that he would not let them take her, would not let them reduce Lily's death to a legal footnote, would not return to the frozen emptiness of ruling without feeling anything ever again. He looked out the window of his study at Northaven sleeping below, at the glass towers reflecting starlight, at the empire he had built and maintained for 287 years through ruthless consistency and emotional detachment. And he knew he was about to destroy it all for one human girl whose heartbeat he could still feel against his chest like an echo, like a promise, like the first sign that something in him might still be capable of being saved. The Council of 7 arrived at dawn, their black robes sweeping through the glass throne hall like a murder of crows descending on carrion. And Casimir watched them file into the judgment hall with the resigned certainty of a man watching his own execution procession. The judgment hall was a circular chamber of glass and light, walls and ceiling transparent to the rising sun, and as morning broke over Northaven, everything turned gold and merciless. every surface reflecting and refracting until there was nowhere to hide, no shadow deep enough to conceal weakness. The glass throne sat at the chamber's center, transparent as everything else in this damned building, offering no concealment, no armor, just cold crystal that showed every angle of whoever sat upon it, and Casimir took his seat there with the careful control of someone who knew he was about to be dissected in public. Elena stood beside the throne at his instruction, barefoot on the black marble floor, still wearing the white human-issue tunic from the relief camp because there had been no time to find her proper clothing, and he could see her shivering slightly, though the chamber was not cold, could see the way her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, could hear her elevated heartbeat even over the rustle of council robes as the 7 members took their seats in the semicircle facing him. Corvain stood at the center, naturally, his expression perfectly neutral in that way that meant he was absolutely certain of victory, and Casimir felt something cold settle in his stomach as his chief counselor began to speak. "Your Majesty, honored council members," Corvain said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official proceedings. "We convene this emergency session to address a matter of grave concern regarding the King's invocation of the Sanctuary Clause and the potential threat posed by prolonged contact with an unsanctioned human. The Edict of Separation, as you all know, was established in 1804 following the catastrophic reign of King Theron, whose emotional attachment to a human consort led to civil war, mass casualties, and ultimately the complete destabilization of our governance structure." Casimir watched Elena's face as Corvain spoke, saw her processing this information, understanding for the first time that there was historical precedent for what was happening between them, that they were not the first to walk this path, and everyone who had walked it before had ended in blood. "The edict," Corvain continued, "exists specifically to prevent vampires from forming emotional bonds with humans, bonds which inevitably lead to attachment pathology when the human ages and dies. Prolonged contact with a human who triggers such pathology in a vampire is classified as a contagion risk, both to the vampire in question and to the stability of our governance. Dr. Cachette, if you would present your findings." A vampire in severe medical robes stepped forward, a woman Casimir vaguely recognized as the council's chief physician, someone he had barely interacted with in 2 centuries, because he had never been ill, never been injured in any way that mattered, never needed medical intervention, because he was functionally immortal and functionally invulnerable and functionally alone. Dr. Cachette pulled up a holographic display that materialized in the air between them. Medical scans that Casimir realized with a jolt of violation had been taken while he slept, his bedroom monitored, his privacy invaded, his body reduced to data points and neurochemical readings. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice clinical and utterly devoid of sympathy. "These scans were taken at 4 a.m. this morning. Your cortisol levels are elevated by 340% above your baseline. Your oxytocin levels are catastrophically high, readings we typically see only in newly bonded mates or parents with infants. Your amygdala activity suggests hypervigilance focused on a single external stimulus." She gestured to another scan, this one showing Casimir's brain lit up in colors he did not understand but knew were damning. "The diagnosis is clear. You are experiencing the first stage of Lethian binding, a neurochemical bond that, if allowed to progress to completion, will tie your survival instinct directly to the continued heartbeat of the human in question. If she dies, you will enter a suicidal fugue state. The historical term for this condition is death grief, and it is universally fatal." Casimir felt the words land like physical blows, but kept his expression neutral, kept his hands steady on the armrests of the glass throne, kept breathing because stopping would confirm everything they were saying. "How long?" he asked, his voice steady despite the roaring in his ears. "How long until the binding completes?" Dr. Cachette consulted her display. "You are already halfway through the second stage," she said. "At current progression rates, Third stage cascade will initiate within 48 to 72 hours. Once that occurs, the binding is irreversible. The Council's recommendation is immediate termination of contact and memory suppression for both parties. We can erase the past 36 hours from both your minds, sever the neurochemical connection before it fully forms, return you to baseline functioning. Casimir stood slowly, and the movement made every council member tense, made Elena take a half step back, made the morning light fracture through the glass walls into 1,000 sharp edges. "No," he said, and the word echoed in the circular chamber. Corvain's expression flickered with something that might have been satisfaction, as if Casimir had just walked into a trap the counselor had carefully constructed. "Sire," he said, his voice gentle in that poisonous way that meant he was about to deliver a killing blow. "Perhaps you should see the evidence before making that decision." He pulled out a small device, the same recording device Casimir had seen at the relief camp, and suddenly the air filled with a holographic projection 10 feet high. Casimir at Ashfeld, Elena crashing into him, his arm wrapping around her, his hand tangling in her hair, his face unguarded and raw with an emotion he had not known he was capable of expressing. "You have not shown this level of attachment to anyone in 287 years, Corvain said quietly. "She is a liability, not just to you, but to every vampire and human in this territory. If you complete this binding and she dies, you will go mad the way King Theron went mad, and we will have to destroy you the way we destroyed him, and thousands will die in the process. She must be eliminated now, while there is still time to save you." The silence that followed was absolute, every council member watching Casimir with expressions ranging from pity to calculation, and he felt the weight of 287 years of rule pressing down on him. All those centuries of careful control and emotional detachment revealing themselves as a prison he had built cell by cell, year by year, until he had forgotten what it felt like to be anything other than alone. Then Elena spoke, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Then kill me and solve your problem," she said, and Casimir's hand shot out before his conscious mind registered movement, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with enough force that she gasped, and he was on his feet, the glass throne behind him, all pretense of control abandoned. "No," he said, and there was something feral in his voice, something that made the council members lean back in their seats. Elena turned to look at him, and for the first time since the camp, he saw her truly seeing him, not as the vampire king, not as the symbol of the system that had killed her sister, but as a man, ancient and desperate and terrified of losing the one thing that had made him feel alive in centuries. She stared into his eyes, and he let her see everything. The fear, the loneliness, the absolute certainty that if she died, he would follow her into whatever darkness waited, and he watched her understand. "You are as trapped as I am," she said. Not a question, a recognition. And something in her expression shifted from shock to grim acceptance to something that looked almost like determination. Casimir turned back to the council, his hand still gripping Elena's wrist, her pulse hammering against his fingers. "The sanctuary clause grants me 72 hours, he said. "When those hours expire, I will submit to a binding assessment. If I am deemed compromised beyond recovery, I will abdicate. But until that clock runs out, she stays, and the hearing for her sister proceeds." The council members exchanged glances, a silent conversation Casimir could read in the minute shifts of expression, the calculations of political advantage and legal precedent, and finally the eldest among them, Councillor Thane, spoke. "The hearing may proceed," he said, "but given the circumstances, it must be public, broadcast to all territories, a full legal proceeding with all protocols observed. If the human fails to prove unlawful enforcement, she will be charged with filing false grievances, and as you know, that is a capital crime." Casimir felt the trap snap shut around them, felt Corvain's satisfaction radiating across the chamber, understood that his chief counselor had maneuvered them into a position where Elena would either win an unwinnable case or die trying, and either outcome would serve Corvain's purposes perfectly. Elena's wrist was still in his grip, her pulse still racing, and when he looked down at her he saw she understood the stakes as clearly as he did. "So if I die, you die," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That is what you are saying." "Essentially," Casimir replied, because there was no point in softening it. Elena stared at him, and he could see her mind working through the implications, through the weight of responsibility she had never asked for, through the realization that her grief-driven impulse at the relief camp had chained them together in ways neither of them could escape. "Then why did you," she started, and stopped, unable to finish the question. "Because I would rather die human than live like this anymore," Casimir said, and the words came out raw and true, stripping away 287 years of careful kingship to reveal the desperate creature underneath. "I have been cold for so long I forgot what warmth felt like. And then you threw yourself at me and I remembered." Dr. Keshet cleared her throat, a delicate sound that nonetheless commanded attention. "Sire," she said, "you are aware that completing the third stage binding will make you vulnerable in ways you have not been vulnerable since you were mortal. Your enemies will be able to destroy you simply by destroying her. Every decision you make will be compromised by the need to keep her alive. You will no longer be the rational, detached ruler this kingdom needs. You will be, for all intents and purposes, human again in the ways that matter most." "I am aware," Casimir said, and released Elena's wrist finally, stepped back, straightened his shoulders. "The hearing will proceed, 72 hours from the moment I invoked sanctuary. That gives us until 8:47 p.m. on November 15th. The council will reconvene at that time for the binding assessment. Until then, she is under my protection, and anyone who harms her answers to me." Corvain bowed, a gesture of perfect formal respect that somehow conveyed complete contempt. "As you command, Your Majesty," he said. "The hearing is scheduled for November 15th at 8 p.m. Public broadcast, full legal protocols, all territories watching. I do hope the human is prepared to make her case." He smiled, small and cold. False grievance charges carry a mandatory death sentence after all. "It would be unfortunate if she survived your binding only to die by our law." The council filed out, black robes disappearing through the glass doors, and Casimir and Elena stood alone in the judgment hall as the sun climbed higher, turning the transparent walls into sheets of burning light. She was looking at him with an expression he could not read, something between anger and understanding, and something else he did not have a name for. "You should have let them erase it," she said finally. "You should have let them take the memory and gone back to being whatever you were before." Casimir shook his head. "I do not want to go back," he said. "I cannot go back. Not now that I know what I have been missing." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, small and vulnerable in the vast golden chamber. "I am going to get you killed," she whispered. "No," Casimir said, moving closer, close enough to feel her warmth, close enough to hear her heartbeat. "You are going to make me alive. There is a difference." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the same desperate hope he felt, the same terrified certainty that they were both hurtling towards something that would either save them or destroy them, and there was no way to know which until they arrived. The 72-hour clock was ticking. The hearing was set. The council was watching. And Casimir realized with perfect clarity that he had just bet everything he was, everything he had built, everything he had become across 287 years of immortality, on the slim chance that one human girl could prove her sister's death mattered enough to change an entire system designed to make sure it did not. The public hearing was set for November 15th at 8 p.m., which gave them exactly 36 hours to build a case that could somehow overcome 221 years of established law, and Casimir knew with brutal clarity that 36 hours would not be enough, had never been enough, would never be enough no matter how many centuries he spent preparing. He assigned Elena a legal advocate anyway, the best in Northaven, a vampire named Silas, who had successfully defended 3 human rights cases in the past decade, 3 wins out of 847 total cases filed, which told you everything you needed to know about the odds they were facing. Elena refused him within 5 minutes. "I will speak for myself," she said, standing in the center of Casimir's study, with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in that stubborn way he was beginning to recognize as her fighting stance. "Silas can advise me if I need it, but I will not have someone else tell Lily's story. She deserves to hear it in my voice." Casimir did not argue, though every tactical instinct screamed that she was making a catastrophic mistake, because he was learning that Elena needed control over something in this situation where she had control over nothing else, needed to feel like an active participant rather than a chess piece being moved across a board by forces she could not see or influence. He dismissed Silas with a nod and turned to find Elena watching him with an expression that suggested she had expected him to fight her on this. "You are not going to tell me I am being stupid?" she asked. "You are being strategically unwise," Casimir said. "But you are also right. If we are asking the council to see your sister as a person rather than a statistic, you need to speak for her yourself. No one else can do that." Something in Elena's posture softened fractionally, the defensive rigidity easing just enough that Casimir could see how exhausted she was, how the past 48 hours had stripped her down to raw nerves and stubborn will. "Thank you," she said quietly, and Casimir felt the words land somewhere in his chest that had been numb for longer than she had been alive. That afternoon, Corvain released a media statement that appeared simultaneously on every newsfeed in every territory, his face filling screens across the kingdom with that expression of concerned authority he had perfected over his 180 years on the council. The statement was a masterwork of political manipulation, framing the upcoming hearing not as a question of whether 2 enforcers had acted unlawfully, but as a fundamental test of whether human grief could override the established legal framework that had maintained peace between species for over 2 centuries. "We sympathize with Miss Volkoff's loss," Corvain said, his voice resonant with practiced compassion. "But we cannot allow individual tragedy, however heartbreaking, to undermine the laws that protect millions. The edict of separation exists because emotional attachments between our species have historically led to catastrophic violence. If we permit this human's grief, and her apparent influence over our king, to rewrite our legal foundations, we risk returning to the chaos that nearly destroyed us all." The reaction was immediate and explosive. In human settlements across the territories, protests erupted within hours, some supporting Elena as a symbol of resistance against vampire authority, others condemning her for allegedly seducing the vampire king and endangering the fragile peace that kept humans alive. Vampire territories responded with their own demonstrations, calls for Elena's immediate execution flooding the council chambers, ancient vampires who remembered King Theron's madness demanding that history not be allowed to repeat itself. The glass throne hall became an armed fortress, security doubled and then tripled, drones circling the building like mechanical vultures waiting for the carnage to begin. Elena watched the news feeds in her suite, sitting on the edge of the bed with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes fixed on the screen as her face appeared again and again. Always the same photo from the relief camp, her hair wild and her expression desperate and her hands reaching for Casimir in a moment that had been private and was now public property, dissected and analyzed and weaponized by thousands of people who had never known her sister, never known her, never known anything except that she represented something they wanted to destroy. Casimir found her there at sunset, the room dark except for the glow of the screen, and he crossed the floor in silence and sat beside her on the bed, close enough that she could feel his presence, but not touching, giving her the choice. "They are making me into a symbol," Elena said, her voice hollow. "They are making Lily into an excuse for political agendas she would have hated." My sister was real. She was a teacher. She loved children. She used to sing off key while she cooked, and now she is just data in Corvain's argument about vampire purity. Casimir watched the screen where a commentator was speculating about whether Elena had deliberately seduced him as part of a human plot to destabilize vampire leadership, and he felt rage settle cold and sharp in his chest. "We will make them see her," he said. "We will make them hear her name." Elena turned to look at him, and in the dim light her eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "If the bond completes," she asked, "what happens to you?" Casimir considered lying, considered softening the truth, considered all the ways he could make this less terrifying for her, and then decided she deserved better than his protection from reality. "I do not know," he admitted. "No vampire king has ever allowed a Lethian binding to finish. Most terminated the human before the third stage, prevented the final cascade." Elena's face went very still. "Why did you not?" she asked, and the question was barely a whisper. Casimir turned to face her fully, and the movement brought them close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could count her eyelashes if he wanted, could hear the slight catch in her breathing. "Because when you threw yourself at me," he said, "I heard your heartbeat, and I realized I had not heard my own in 200 years. I have been functionally dead for so long, I forgot what it felt like to be alive. And then you crashed into me and demanded I help you save your sister, and for the first time in 2 centuries, I felt my heart beat in response to something that mattered. I could not kill that. I could not go back to the silence." Elena stared at him, and he watched her process this, watched her understand that what was happening between them was not his choice or her choice, but something that had chosen them both, a biological imperative neither of them had asked for, and neither of them could escape. "If you lose the throne because of me," she started. "I have sat on that throne for 287 years, Casimir interrupted. "I have never once felt alive doing it." Elena's breath hitched. "What if I am not worth it?" she whispered. Casimir reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not, he cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You threw yourself at the most dangerous creature in this territory to demand justice for your sister," he said. "You stood in front of the Council of Seven and offered them your life to solve their political problem. You refused to let them erase her memory or yours. You are worth more than the throne ever was." That night, Elena could not sleep, her mind cycling through everything that could go wrong at the hearing, every way she could fail Lily, every word she might say that would condemn Casimir along with herself. And finally at 3 a.m. she gave up and left her suite, wandering through the dark corridors of the glass throne hall until she found herself outside Casimir's study. Light spilled from under the door. She knocked softly and heard his voice, distracted and rough with exhaustion, tell her to enter. She found him surrounded by case law, documents scattered across every surface, maps of historical vampire territories pinned to the walls. Cold coffee abandoned on the desk beside him. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression shifted, the focused intensity of research giving way to concern. "You should be sleeping," he said. "So should you," Elena replied, and closed the door behind her. Casimir gestured to the papers covering his desk. "I am reviewing the case law from 1804, he said, "the year the Edict of Separation was written, trying to find precedent for overturning it." Elena moved closer, looking at the documents, seeing dates and names and legal language that meant nothing to her except that Casimir had been awake all night, searching for a way to save her. "Is there precedent?" she asked. Casimir's silence was answer enough. He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "The last vampire king who allowed himself to bond to a human was King Theron," he said. "He ruled from 1782 to 1804. His human wife, Catherine, was 30 years old when they bonded. She lived another 47 years, and when she died of old age, Theron went mad. He could not accept that she was gone, could not accept that he would continue existing without her. So he decided nothing should continue existing. He slaughtered 3,000 vampires and humans alike before the council managed to destroy him. The Edict of Separation was written in his blood, literally. The council used Theron's blood as ink when they drafted it. A reminder of what happens when vampires forget what they are. Elena felt cold seep through her chest. They will use that history to justify killing me, she said. Casimir turned to face her, and his expression was bleak. I need you to understand, he said. If we lose the hearing, I cannot protect you. The law will demand your execution, and if I refuse, they will remove me and kill you anyway. I will have sacrificed everything and saved nothing. Elena looked at him, this ancient, lonely man who was dismantling his entire world for her, who was risking madness and death and the destruction of everything he had built across 287 years because she had thrown herself at him in grief and desperation. Then we do not lose, she said. Casimir's mouth quirked in something that was not quite a smile. You make it sound simple. Elena shook her head. It is not simple. It is impossible. But I did not survive the camp and the council and the past 48 hours just to give up now. Lily mattered, and I am going to make sure everyone knows it. Are you afraid? Casimir asked. And the question was gentle. Terrified, Elena admitted. But not of dying, of forgetting that Lily mattered, of letting her become just another number in a report no one will read. Casimir crossed the room to her, and when he spoke his voice was a promise. Whatever happens at that hearing, whatever the council decides, I will make sure she is remembered. I will make sure her name is spoken. I will make sure she mattered. It was the first promise that made Elena want to survive. Casimir received the intelligence at 9 a.m., delivered by one of his remaining loyal operatives, a vampire named Marcus, who had served him for 60 years and who looked sick as he presented the information. Sire, Marcus said quietly, Corvain has located the 2 enforcers who killed Lily Volkov. He has convinced them to testify at the hearing. They will state that Elena provoked the incident, that her sister was engaged in suspicious behavior, that the enforcement was justified under standing protocols. Casimir felt the information land like a physical blow, felt the carefully constructed case he had been building all night collapse into rubble. How much did Corvain pay them? He asked. Marcus hesitated. He offered them guaranteed positions in his personal guard, he said, protection from any future legal consequences. And he has their testimony recorded and verified. Even if you could discredit them at the hearing, the recordings will stand as evidence. The case was collapsing before it had even begun, the slim chance of victory narrowing to nothing. And Casimir dismissed Marcus with instructions to continue monitoring Corvain's movements, and then sat alone in his study staring at the ruin of his strategy. Elena overheard the conversation, standing in the hallway outside the study where she had been coming to find him, and when she entered the room, her face was white. So it is over, she said. Casimir looked up at her, at this human woman who had somehow become more important than his throne, more essential than his immortality, and he felt something fierce and desperate settle in his chest. Not while you are still breathing, he said. Elena crossed to his desk. What are you planning? She asked. Casimir shook his head. Nothing you need to know about yet. Elena's eyes narrowed. If you are going to do something stupid to save me, I am going to do whatever it takes to save you. Casimir interrupted. Stupid, or otherwise, that is not your decision to make. Elena's voice rose. You do not get to sacrifice yourself for me without asking. You do not get to. She stopped, breath hitching, and Casimir saw tears in her eyes for the first time since the council hearing. You do not get to make yourself matter this much, and then throw your life away. That night, Casimir met secretly with Dr. Cachette in the medical wing. The halls empty and dark, the only light coming from the examination room where she waited with her holographic displays and her clinical detachment. You wanted to ask about third stage binding, Keshet said as he entered. It was not a question. Casimir nodded. If it completes, he said. What exactly happens? Keshet pulled up a series of neurological scans, brain chemistry models that showed cascading connections Casimir did not fully understand, but recognized as fundamental rewiring. Your survival instinct will recalibrate, she said. Currently, your brain prioritizes your own survival above all else, standard vampire neurology. But once third stage binding completes, your brain will prioritize her survival above your own. If she is threatened, you will respond with the same defensive intensity you would currently reserve for a direct threat to yourself. If she dies, your brain will interpret it as your own death and will shut down non-essential functions, including the will to continue existing. She paused. You will become emperor of nothing if she dies, sire. You will have all the power in the world and no desire to use it for anything except ending your own existence. Then I will make sure she does not die, Casimir said. Keshet studied him with an expression that might have been pity. The third stage cascade is already beginning, she said quietly. I can see it in your readings from this morning. You have perhaps 24 hours before it becomes irreversible. You could still choose to end this, sever contact, accept the memory suppression, return to what you were. Casimir shook his head. I do not want to return to what I was, he said. I want to become something that can feel again. Late that night, Elena found Casimir on the rooftop garden overlooking Northaven, standing among the winter roses with frost gathering on the glass enclosure and the city lights scattered below like fallen stars. He heard her approach but did not turn, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. Why are you willing to risk everything? Elena asked, coming to stand beside him. For 36 hours we have known each other. For most of that time I have been a political problem you were trying to solve. Why does this matter so much? Casimir was quiet for a long moment, watching his breath mist in the cold air, a reminder that he was still capable of breathing, even if he no longer needed to. Because for 287 years, he said finally, I have not felt anything. I have ruled this kingdom with perfect rationality and absolute detachment. I have made every decision based on logic and political calculation. I have been efficient and effective and completely empty. And then you looked at me like I was still human enough to help you, like I was still capable of choosing compassion over law, like I still mattered as something more than a symbol. And for the first time in 2 centuries, I felt like maybe I did. I cannot go back to being what I was before that. I cannot go back to the silence. Elena stepped closer, and in the dim light from the city below, Casimir could see she was shivering despite the warm coat someone had found for her. I do not want you to, she said quietly, and reached out to take his hand. First intentional touch, her fingers threading through his, her palm warm against his cold skin, and Casimir felt the bond hum between them like electricity, like music, like the first note of a song he had forgotten how to sing. He turned to face her fully, his other hand coming up to cup her face the way he had the night before, and Elena leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. What happens at the hearing? She whispered. I do not know, Casimir admitted. But I know I would rather face it with you than face another 287 years without you. Elena opened her eyes, and he saw fear there, and determination, and something else he did not have a name for yet, but recognized nonetheless. Then we face it together, she said. Together, Casimir agreed, and they stood there in the frost and the dark, with the city lights below and the stars above, and 36 hours until everything would either end or begin. The judgment hall had been transformed into something that felt less like a courtroom and more like a gladiatorial arena, floodlights blazing from every corner, cameras mounted on tracks that circled the room like predators sizing up their prey, the glass walls and ceiling reflecting light until the entire space seemed to burn with artificial brightness that left nowhere to hide, and nothing unseen. Elena sat alone at the petitioner's stand, a glass podium positioned in the exact center of the circular chamber, and she felt exposed in a way that went beyond physical visibility, felt like every camera lens was stripping away skin and muscle and bone until only her raw nerve endings remained. Trembling and hypersensitive to the weight of 12 million viewers watching across all territories, human and vampire alike, all of them waiting to see whether she would save herself or condemn herself with her own words. Casimir stood at the rear of the hall, forbidden by protocol from sitting on the glass throne during proceedings where he had granted sanctuary, and his hands were clenched at his sides hard enough that Elena could see the tension from across the room, could see the barely controlled violence in his stillness, could feel through the bond that was now constantly humming between them his desperate need to protect her and his absolute inability to do anything except watch. The Council of Seven presided from their elevated semicircle, black robes stark against the white marble, faces impassive in that way that meant they had already decided the outcome, and this hearing was merely theater, merely procedure, merely a formality before they delivered the verdict they had written before Elena ever entered the room. Corvain stood at the prosecutor's stand opposite Elena, and when he spoke, his voice carried the smooth authority of someone who had never once doubted his right to determine who lived and who died. Miss Elena Marsh seeks to challenge the lawful actions of enforcers Diane Volkov and Saren Cross, he began, his words measured and cold. These enforcers responded appropriately when a human child, one Lily Marsh, touched vampire property without authorization. Under Section 47 of the Territorial Code, such contact constitutes theft and authorizes immediate corrective force. The enforcers acted within established protocol to maintain order and discourage future violations. This hearing will demonstrate that while we sympathize with Miss Marsh's grief, the law exists to protect all citizens, vampire and human alike, and cannot be overturned simply because one individual finds its application painful. The enforcers testified next, Diane Volkov first, a vampire who looked barely older than 20, but whose personnel file showed him at 140 years old, 90 of those years spent in enforcement. He spoke with the flat affect of someone reciting a memorized script, his eyes never quite meeting Elena's as he described how the human child had lunged at the apple cart, how he and his partner had assessed the situation as potential theft in progress, how they had issued a verbal warning that went unheeded, how corrective force had been applied in accordance with training and regulation. Then Saren Cross took the stand, older in appearance, perhaps 30 when he was turned, and his testimony matched Volkov's word for word in a way that made Elena's stomach turn because she knew they were lying, knew Lily had never lunged anywhere, knew there had been no warning, knew with absolute certainty that her sister had died not because she broke the law, but because two vampires had seen a hungry human child as an opportunity to exercise the power they had been given over something small and helpless and defenseless. Elena took the stand when the enforcers finished, her legs shaking so badly she had to grip the edges of the glass podium to keep herself upright, her voice cracking on the first words. But then she thought of Lily, thought of her sister's laugh and her terrible singing, and the way she drew birds in the margins of her schoolwork, and her voice steadied into something that could carry across the vast hall, across the cameras, across 12 million people who would hear this whether they wanted to or not. My sister's name was Lily Marsh, Elena said, and she was 8 years old. She loved drawing birds even though she had never seen most of them, because photographs were all we had left after the territories were established. She was terrified of the dark, and she used to crawl into my bed at night and make me tell her stories until she fell asleep. She wanted to be a teacher like our mother was before the collapse. She had her whole life ahead of her. Elena's hands tightened on the podium, knuckles white against the transparent surface. The day she died, we had not eaten in 2 days because our ration cards were delayed in processing. We were in the market district, trying to see if anyone would trade for the few things we still had. And Lily saw an apple at the edge of a cart. Just one apple. It had rolled to the very edge, almost falling off. She was hungry. She was 8 years old and hungry, and she reached for something that looked like it was already discarded. And they killed her for it. Elena's voice cracked, and she felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to give the cameras that vulnerability. She did not lunge. She did not ignore a warning. She reached for an apple because she was a starving child, and she did not know your laws because children should not have to know that touching food can be a death sentence. She was 8 years old. 8. And you killed her. Corvain's voice cut through the silence that followed. Miss Marsh, he said, his tone almost gentle, almost sympathetic in a way that made Elena want to scream. We understand your grief, but ignorance of law is not immunity from consequence. The territorial code exists because without clear boundaries, we would return to the chaos of the collapse. Your sister's death is tragic, but the law was applied correctly. The enforcers cannot be held responsible for your sister's lack of knowledge about protocols that keep all humans safe. Elena turned to look directly at the main camera. The one she knew was broadcasting her face to every screen in every territory. Then your law is monstrous, she said, and her voice was steady now, was clear and cold and absolutely certain. If your law says that a hungry 8-year-old child deserves to die for reaching toward an apple, then your law is not protecting anyone. It is just giving you permission to kill us and call it justice. The room erupted, council members demanding order, Corvain's objections rising over the noise, human protesters outside the building screaming in support or condemnation, depending on which side of the divide they fell. And through it all, Elena stood at the glass podium, watching Casimir at the back of the hall, watching him step forward against all protocol, watching the room go silent as every eye turned to the vampire king who was breaking every rule to save a human girl who had called his law monstrous in front of 12 million witnesses. Casimir's voice cut through the silence with the absolute authority of 287 years of unchallenged rule. I invoke my right as sovereign to submit evidence, he said, and produced a data chip that he handed to the council's chief recorder. This footage was obtained from the Market District's security feed through channels I am not required to disclose. It shows the incident in question from multiple angles. I request the council review it before proceeding with judgment. Corvain was on his feet immediately. Sire, you cannot testify in a case where you have granted sanctuary, he said, his voice sharp with barely controlled rage. It compromises the integrity of the proceedings and invalidates. I am not testifying, Casimir interrupted, his eyes fixed on Corvain with an intensity that made the older vampire step back involuntarily. I am exercising sovereign authority to correct the record. The council may accept or reject the evidence as they see fit, but they will review it before rendering judgment. The council had no choice, not with 12 million viewers watching, not with Casimir standing in the center of the hall, radiating the kind of controlled fury that reminded everyone watching that he was the most dangerous creature in the room and had chosen until now to be gentle. They reviewed the footage on the holographic displays that materialized above the judgment stand, and Elena watched Lily's death play out again from 4 different angles, watched her sister approach the apple cart slowly, tentatively, watched her reach out with one small hand, watched the enforcers see her from 20 feet away, and consciously choose, to engage with lethal force instead of a simple verbal correction, watched Lily crumple to the ground while the vampires walked away, discussing their dinner plans as if they had not just murdered a child. The council deliberated for 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours, and when Councillor Thane finally spoke, his voice was grave. The evidence shows that while the enforcers acted within the letter of the law, they violated its spirit, he said. Section 47 authorizes corrective force, but it does not mandate lethal force in cases of minor infractions by juvenile offenders. The appropriate response would have been a verbal warning, followed by escort back to the human quarter. The council finds that enforcers Volkov and Cross exercised excessive force. Punishment: demotion and reassignment to non-enforcement duties. Not execution, not even imprisonment, just reassignment. Elena felt the words land like blows, felt something inside her chest crack and splinter, felt fury and grief and absolute despair crash over her in waves that threatened to pull her under. "That is it," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "Lily is dead and they get reassigned. They murdered an 8-year-old child and you are sending them to different jobs." Dr. Keshet rose from her position at the medical observation station, her face professionally neutral, but her voice carrying an urgency that commanded immediate attention. "The king's neurochemical markers indicate imminent third-stage binding," she announced, her words echoing through the hall. "If this hearing continues, his biology will complete the bond within the hour. I strongly recommend immediate cessation of proceedings to allow time for intervention and possible reversal of the cascade." Casimir turned to look at Elena, and she looked back at him across the length of the judgment hall, across the cameras and the council and the 12 million watching eyes, and in his expression she saw a question, saw him offering her one final chance to walk away, to let the doctors intervene and erase the bond and return them both to what they had been before she threw herself at him in desperate grief. And Elena realized with perfect clarity that she did not want to go back, did not want to return to the numbness and isolation and grinding survival that had defined her existence before Casimir had looked at her like she mattered, before he had chosen her over an empire, before he had made her feel like Lily's death could mean something more than just another statistic in a report no one would read. "Let it complete," Casimir said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. The council froze, every member staring at him in shock, and Corvain stood so abruptly his chair clattered to the floor. "Sire," he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed triumph, "if you complete a Lethian binding, you forfeit your right to rule." Clause 9 of the Sovereign Charter explicitly states that any vampire king who forms a survival-dependent bond with a human is deemed compromised beyond capacity to govern and must abdicate within 24 hours of bond completion. "I am aware," Casimir said, his voice calm and absolutely certain, "and I accept the consequences." He crossed the hall to Elena, every step captured by a dozen cameras, broadcast to 12 million screens, and when he reached the glass podium, he took her hands in his cold fingers wrapping around her warm ones with a gentleness that made her throat tighten. "You asked me why I care," he said, speaking to her but knowing the world was listening. "It is because you made me feel human again. You looked at me like I was still capable of compassion instead of just calculation, like I still mattered as something more than a symbol of authority. And I would rather live one human lifetime with you, feeling everything, than spend another eternity alone on that throne, feeling nothing." Elena felt the bond lock into place like a key turning in a mechanism she had not known existed, felt something fundamental shift in her chest, felt Casimir's presence settle into her consciousness like he had always been there, and she had just been waiting for him to arrive. Dr. Keshet's monitors spiked, alarms sounding, holographic displays showing neurochemical cascades in both their brains. The third stage binding, initiating, and completing in the space of heartbeats, irreversible now, permanent, tying their survival instincts together in ways that meant if one died, the other would follow, would want to follow, would be biologically incapable of choosing to continue existing alone. Corvain moved immediately, his voice ringing with authority as he addressed the council. "I call for an emergency vote on abdication," he said. "The king has completed a Lethian binding and is therefore compromised beyond capacity to rule. Clause 9 requires—" "The sanctuary clause grants me 72 hours, Casimir interrupted, not raising his voice but somehow filling the hall with sound nonetheless. "I invoked it at 8:47 p.m. on November 13th, It expires at 8:47 p.m. tonight. I still have 4 hours, and in that time, I am issuing a sovereign decree under emergency powers granted by Article 12 of the Founding Charter." He turned to face the council, still holding Elena's hands, and when he spoke, every word was captured and broadcast, and recorded for history. "The Territorial Code, Section 47, is hereby suspended, pending comprehensive review and revision," he said. "No human will be executed for incidental contact with vampire property without clear evidence of intent to steal or harm. All enforcement protocols will be revised to prioritize de-escalation over lethal force when dealing with juvenile offenders. And Elena Marsh is appointed Special Advocate for Human Affairs, effective immediately, with full authority to investigate complaints of unlawful enforcement and recommend systemic reforms." The council erupted in protest, voices overlapping in outrage and shock, Corvain's objections rising above the rest, as he argued that Casimir could not issue binding decrees while under the influence of neurochemical compromise. But Casimir's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You wanted me to prove she was not a liability," he said, his words sharp and cold and absolutely final. "There is your proof. She is the only person in this room who had the courage to name our law for what it has become. Not protection, not justice, just cruelty dressed in legal language. If caring about that makes me compromised, then I have been compromised for 287 years by caring about nothing." He turned to Elena, and his expression softened into something that looked almost like peace. "You wanted Lily to matter," he said quietly. "Now she does. Her death will change the law, and her name will be remembered. You won." Elena was crying, but not from grief this time, not from the hollow rage that had consumed her since watching Lily die, but from relief, from hope, from the overwhelming realization that her sister's death would not be meaningless, would not be forgotten, would not be just another line in a report that no one read. She squeezed Casimir's hands and felt him squeeze back, felt the bond humming between them like a living thing, felt 12 million people watching as she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his and whispered thank you in a voice that only he could hear. "The hearing is adjourned," Councillor Thane announced, his voice heavy with resignation. "The decree stands pending further review. The king has 4 hours remaining before abdication proceedings commence." The broadcast ended. The cameras powered down, the floodlights dimmed, and Casimir and Elena stood together in the center of the judgment hall while the council filed out in silence, and Corvain's expression promised that this was not over, that the next 4 hours would determine whether they had won anything at all or merely bought themselves time to watch everything they had built collapse around them. But for now, in this moment, with the bond complete and Lily's name spoken to millions, and the law changed, even if the cost was everything Casimir had been, for the past 287 years, Elena let herself believe they had won something that mattered. 4 hours until abdication. 4 hours to figure out how to survive what came next. The 72-hour sanctuary window expired at exactly 8:47 p.m., and Casimir felt the legal protection dissolve like morning frost under sunlight, felt the invisible shield that had kept Elena safe for 3 days vanish and leave her exposed to whatever the council decided to do next. At 9:00 p.m., 13 minutes later, the council convened in the judgment hall with the formal solemnity of executioners preparing for a state-sanctioned killing, though this time the death would be political rather than physical, the end of a reign rather than a life. And Casimir stood before them with Elena at his side and felt 287 years of absolute authority slip through his fingers like water. Councillor Thane spoke with the weight of centuries pressing down on every word. "Casimir Thorne, by the authority vested in this council by the Sovereign Charter, we accept your abdication as required by Clause 9, he said. "You have completed Alethian binding to a human and are therefore compromised beyond capacity to govern alone. Your reign ends as of this moment. The succession vote will commence immediately. Casimir inclined his head in acknowledgement, feeling nothing but relief, feeling the throne he had occupied for 287 years become someone else's burden, someone else's prison, someone else's lonely vigil in the dark. Corvain stood from his council seat, already moving into position as the presumptive successor, his expression controlled but his eyes bright with triumph, and Casimir watched him prepare to claim everything Casimir had just relinquished, and felt only pity for what Corvain thought he was winning. Dr. Cachette rose abruptly from her medical station, her face pale and her voice urgent in a way Casimir had never heard from her before. "I must interrupt with an emergency medical report," she said, pulling up holographic displays that filled the air with neurochemical scans and biological data. "The third stage binding between Casimir Thorne and Elena Marsh has stabilized, but not in any configuration I have observed in historical records. Typically, Lethian bonds create a one-way dependency where the vampire's survival instinct becomes tied to the human's continued existence. But these scans show a reciprocal bond." She gestured to Elena's brain chemistry, highlighting patterns that pulsed in rhythm with Casimir's own neural activity. "The human subject is bonding to the vampire as well," she said, her voice carrying a note of scientific wonder mixed with profound concern. "This phenomenon has never been recorded. Her neurochemical markers indicate that if Casimir Thorne dies, she will enter the same suicidal fugue state he would experience if she died. They are mutually dependent. Neither can survive the loss of the other." The council stared at the displays in shocked silence, and Casimir felt Elena's hand find his, felt her fingers thread through his fingers with a steadiness that told him she had already known, had already felt the bond settling into place on both sides, had already accepted what it meant. Corvain recovered first, his voice sharp as he dismissed the medical report with a wave of his hand. "While fascinating, this is irrelevant to the abdication proceedings," he said. "Casimir Thorne has already relinquished the throne. The succession must continue." Elena stepped forward, and every eye in the chamber turned to her. This human girl in borrowed formal clothes, who had somehow become the center of a political earthquake that was reshaping centuries of vampire governance. "I invoke the dual sovereignty clause," she said, her voice clear and steady and absolutely certain. Established in 1623 under the reign of King Matthias, the clause states that a vampire ruler who has abdicated due to human bonding may retain a co-regency if the bonded human agrees to accept equal governance responsibility and passes a council trial by questioning to demonstrate competence and commitment to the welfare of all territories. The silence that followed was absolute, every council member frozen in shock, and Casimir stared at Elena with something that felt like awe because he had not told her about the dual sovereignty clause, had not even thought of it himself because it had not been invoked in 402 years, had been written into law during a brief period of progressive reform, and then quietly buried under centuries of tradition that preferred vampire rulers to remain unencumbered by human influence. But Elena had found it somehow, had researched it during the 4 hours between the hearing and the abdication, had armed herself with the one weapon that could let them keep what they had built. "This is absurd," Corvain said, his voice rising with barely controlled rage. "The dual sovereignty clause was written for a different era, a different context. Miss Marsh is not qualified, is not vampire, is not remotely prepared to govern millions of citizens across multiple territories. Granting her co-regency would destabilize the entire system. The law is clear," Councillor Thane said slowly, his eyes moving between Elena and the holographic display of the charter that had materialized at her invocation. "If a bonded human requests the trial, we must grant it. The clause has never been formally repealed." "I formally request the trial," Elena said, and Casimir heard the tremor beneath her steady voice, heard the terror she was hiding, heard the desperate courage it took to stand in front of 7 ancient vampires and demand they give her power over the very system that had killed her sister. "I understand the law. I understand the history. I understand what I am asking, and I am ready to prove I can do this. The trial began at midnight. The judgment hall reconfigured with Elena standing alone at the petitioner's stand, while the Council of Seven took turns interrogating her on law, policy, history, ethics, governance theory, every question designed to expose her ignorance and justify rejecting her request. Casimir stood at the back of the room again, forbidden from intervening, forced to watch as they dissected her knowledge and tested her understanding and pushed her to the absolute limits of what she had learned in 4 days of intensive study. Counselor Thane asked about the historical precedents for the Edict of Separation, and Elena recited the events of 1804 with perfect accuracy, described King Theron's descent into madness and the civil war that followed, and the 3,000 deaths that had convinced the council that vampire-human bonds were too dangerous to permit. Counselor Marin asked about the economic structure of the territories, and Elena explained the resource allocation system, the ration distribution networks, the trade agreements between vampire and human settlements, her answers drawing on 4 days of conversation with Casimir and a lifetime of surviving within a system she was now asking permission to change. For 3 hours they questioned her, and for 3 hours she answered, her voice growing hoarse but never uncertain, her knowledge expanding beyond what Casimir had taught her to encompass insights from her own experience living as a human under vampire law. Perspectives the council had never considered, because they had never bothered to ask a human what it felt like to be governed by creatures who saw them as inferior. And Casimir watched her transform from the grief-stricken refugee who had thrown herself at him 4 days ago into something that looked like a queen, fierce and intelligent, and absolutely determined to prove she deserved the power she was claiming. Finally, at 3:30 a.m., Corvain stood and delivered the question Casimir had known was coming. Why should a human be granted power over vampires? Corvain asked, his voice cold and precise. You are mortal, fragile, limited in understanding by your brief lifespan and narrow experience. You have lived in this system for 24 years. We have governed it for centuries. What possible justification exists for giving you authority over creatures vastly older, stronger, and more knowledgeable than you will ever be? Elena met Corvain's eyes and did not flinch. Because I have lived on both sides, she said quietly. I know what your laws look like from the perspective of someone who has no power, no voice, no choice but to obey or die. I know what it feels like to watch my sister bleed out on a street corner while vampires walk past discussing their dinner plans. I know what it costs to survive in a system designed to make humans grateful for permission to exist. And I will spend every single day of my life making sure your laws cost less. Making sure the next 8-year-old child who reaches for an apple does not die for it. Making sure humans are seen as people, not problems to be managed. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of Lily's death, and the 4 days of fighting, and the bond that tied her survival to Casimir's, and everything she had lost, and everything she had gained. You are right that I am mortal, she said. I have perhaps 60 years left if I am lucky. But that means I do not have centuries to waste on maintaining traditions that serve no purpose except preserving your comfort. I do not have time to be patient with injustice, and I will not spend my brief life watching humans die for laws that could be changed if anyone cared enough to try. The silence that followed was profound, and Casimir saw several council members exchange glances, saw something shift in their expressions, saw the calculation change from whether she was qualified to whether they could afford to reject her when 12 million people had watched her stand up to the vampire king and demand justice for her sister. At 3:47 a.m., Councillor Thane called for the vote, and Casimir held his breath while the council members cast their decisions in the ancient way. 7 stones placed in the voting urn. White for approval and black for rejection. 4 white stones, 3 black stones. The dual sovereignty clause was invoked. Elena Marsh became co-sovereign of the Vampire Territories at 3:51 a.m. on November 16, 2025, and Casimir watched her face as the council formally acknowledged her authority and saw the shock give way to fierce determination, saw her straighten her shoulders and accept the weight of governance the way she had accepted every impossible burden thrown at her over the past 4 days, with grace and courage and absolute refusal to break. Casimir remained king, but now he shared the glass throne with a human who had the legal authority to veto any law that harmed her people, who had the power to rewrite the system that had killed her sister, who had transformed grief into purpose and survival into revolution. Corvain stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "You have set a precedent that will destroy everything we have built," he said, his words directed at Casimir, but his eyes fixed on Elena, with something that looked like hatred, mixed with grudging respect. "You have given humans a taste of power they will never willingly relinquish. You have undermined 221 years of careful separation. You have planted the seeds of a war you will not live to see finished." "Good," Casimir said quietly, moving to stand beside Elena, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of support and partnership that 12 million people had watched form over the past 4 days. "It needed destroying. The system you are protecting is built on the premise that humans are lesser, expendable, acceptable casualties in the name of order, and I would rather burn it all down than spend another century pretending that premise is anything other than monstrous." Corvain stared at him for a long moment, and Casimir saw the counselor making calculations, planning strategies, preparing for battles that would come in months or years, when the shock of tonight wore off, and the resistance to change organized itself into something more dangerous than one defeated politician. Then Corvain bowed, a gesture of formal respect that somehow conveyed absolute contempt, and left the judgment hall without another word, his footsteps echoing through the vast chamber until the doors closed behind him and the sound died into silence. The council dispersed, some members offering congratulations that sounded genuine and others offering congratulations that sounded like warnings. And finally Casimir and Elena stood alone in the judgment hall while dawn began to break through the glass ceiling, turning everything gold and warm and painfully beautiful. Casimir took Elena's hand and led her to the balcony that overlooked Northaven, the same balcony where 4 days ago he had looked down at the city and felt nothing but the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders, and the cold certainty that he would rule alone forever. They stood together as the sun rose over the glass buildings and the human settlements and the vampire territories, as frost melted on the railings and the cold wind gave way to something that felt almost like warmth, and Elena asked the question Casimir had been waiting for. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we rewrite the laws," Casimir replied, pulling her close against his side, breathing in the scent of her hair and the sound of her heartbeat and the fierce warmth of her presence. Together. No more edicts written in blood. No more children dying for apples. No more separation between species when cooperation serves everyone better. We rebuild the system from the ground up, and we do it right this time." Elena turned to look at him, this ancient, lonely man who had chosen her over eternity, who had dismantled 287 years of absolute authority because she had looked at him like he was still capable of compassion, who had completed a death bond rather than return to the cold silence of ruling alone. "I love you," she said. And it was the first time she had spoken the words, the first time she had named what had been growing between them since the moment she threw herself at his feet and demanded he help her save her sister. Casimir pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her face the way he had a dozen times before, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted every violent thing he had been across 287 years. "I know," he said quietly. "I heard your heartbeat. I have been hearing it for 4 days. It is the only sound that has mattered in 2 centuries." Elena smiled, and it was the first real smile Casimir had seen from her. Not the desperate survival smile or the political smile, but something genuine and warm and full of painful, beautiful hope. "Then kiss me," she whispered. "Kiss me while the sun comes up and the world changes, and we figure out how to build something that does not cost so much blood." Casimir kissed her as the sun broke over Northaven, warm and gold, and full of a future neither of them had expected to have 4 days ago, and the bond between them hummed with the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Co-sovereigns of a kingdom they were determined to transform into something that honored the living instead of just managing the dying.